All right, hello everybody. I'm Dr. Scott Masson. I am going to introduce you in this little video here to the course syllabus for our survey of English literature, although it's a survey to literature in general, ranging from John Milton's Paradise Lost all the way up to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I've been teaching this course now at Tyndale for 17 years. I guess this is probably going on 18. And I've changed the syllabus a little bit over the years, but by and large, it's remained intact. It's largely changed at the back end of the course rather than at the front end. Every survey course, at least the part 2, begins with the work Paradise Lost by John Milton, written towards the end of the 17th century. And we left off, at least in my section last class, with a look at John Donne and the work of George Herbert, Puritan writers, one an Anglican, actually both of them Anglicans, but very much products of the 17th century. Milton is beginning in and around the same age. He's born in 1608, I believe, and so had some overlap, probably overheard some of the sermons of John Donne himself, because Milton was at St. Paul's School in London at the same time that Donne was preaching from St. Paul's pulpit, which is not that far away from it. So they may have had some overlap in that sense. Just gives you a sense of the chronology. I'm going to go in, as this is just the introduction to the course, I'm just going to go over the syllabus with you and make a few brief remarks. I am conscious of the fact that when I began this course, I was largely speaking to those whom our sociologists deem to be millennials. And now I am, I believe, speaking to those who they will call Generation Z or Zoomers, whatever those designations are worth. In the case of the millennials, one of the great challenges that they faced was the fact that, as far as I understand it, that something akin to 60% of them no longer believed in an objective moral right or moral wrong, 60%, which is an extraordinary state of affairs in the grand scheme of humanity, because it's certainly the case, as C.S. Lewis argues in The Abolition of Man, that every society, historically speaking, believed in an objective moral right and wrong. And that would have distinguished certainly a modern society as well up until a certain point of time. And we'll look at what that timeline was on this in this survey. But Lewis deals with that topic and the consequences educationally, civilizationally, etc. in his little work, The Abolition of Man. We're not doing that on this course. I do it on my science fiction and subcreation course, among others. But I say that because although it's no longer the case that I'm speaking probably to millennials in this lecture, I am probably still dealing with the same issue of a lack of belief in an objective moral right and wrong. And if you're interested in an argument about why that is an irrational view, you might want to look at the first chapters of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where he argues that we, although we may wish to deny that there are such things, we depend on our sense of rightness and wrongness every time we appeal to fairness or justice. We expect other people to acknowledge something which we believe they violated. Even while we ourselves may claim that there is no such thing, we still feel the sting of injustice or unfairness. And where do we get this sense other than a sense that it is built into the fabric of the whole universe, that is justice? That was certainly the case last semester. All of the works would have understood there to be a strong, clear sense of right and wrong, and that's irrespective of the religious position that was taken, whether you were a pagan and a polytheist or whether you were a Christian and believed that there was only one God who exists in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In both cases, there would have been a sense of moral right and moral wrong that they would have agreed upon. And that's certainly the case when we begin this semester as well with C.S. Lewis, with John Milton in his Paradise Lost. Milton simply takes it as an axiom, as something that everyone will ascribe to, that there is such a thing as a moral right and wrong, and he depicts it in the forms of personages, God on the one hand, and Satan and his cohorts on the other. He's not arguing for this. He's not trying to persuade us that there are such things. He assumes that we know that this is the way things are. He's clearly not writing for this particular context, namely ours. But as I say, I began when I started teaching this course with millennials in my class. Now I have those from Generation Z, and that's not irrelevant here because, of course, Generation Z or the Zoomers have grown up as you have with technology being a part of the structure of your existence. So you've never experienced life without the internet. And without portable digital technology, cell phones and so forth. And it's also, so that's new. Your generation has experienced this and nothing else but that. And it's certainly the case that a digital humanity or a humanity that accesses one another through digital media experiences life in a very different way than that of previous generations. And it's not just that you have a greater facility with the technology, it's that you engage with things in a very different way and also think about things in a different way. Whether that banishes the notions of right or wrong is another matter. I don't think it's that easily eradicated. But one could get this, the impression that these things were as negotiable as technologically manipulatable as other things. So as I speak, it's the 10th of January 2021. 4 days ago, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, was I believe thrown off Twitter, censored by a media company. Which many, including myself, saw as an extraordinary event, unprecedented, and really quite a power move because he has thereby been excluded. The most powerful individual has been excluded from a means of communication with others. And so what we see here is, to some degree, the intrusion of power and censorship in the public square. Well, these things are not unprecedented in of themselves, but the technological clampdown is unprecedented, and it does bring about, to some degree, a very brave new world, which is just by the by the title of the last work we'll be looking at on the course. But Milton is dealing in a very different world, with a very different world than we are, and he would have read materials in a very different way than we are, and would have interacted with his teachers in a very different way than you're being forced to do so through the means of technology here, because once again, because of COVID. And furthermore, and I'm wearing these glasses for the reason I'm just about to articulate, I had a concussion. I had a terrible car accident on December 19th, and it's left me with a concussion. These are blue light reducing or eliminating lenses, not yet corrective lenses, but they do that to try and alleviate some of the concussion symptoms. And so my means of instruction this semester will largely be through recorded lectures. Some of them I've already recorded, thankfully, and some of them which I will pre-record in order to reduce the stress on focusing, concentrating on a screen, which I'd have to do if I did it more interactively. Now, I hope as the semester goes on that I'll be able to push the boat out a bit further and be more interactive. But for now, I think I'm going to have to limit that quite drastically and use pre-recorded instruction during the class time still, but they'll be available online, and I'll provide links and so forth. And I hope, and I apologize for that, and I hope that you find that acceptable given my personal limitations for now. But I'm thankful to be here and to teach you these great books. We begin with John Milton, as I say, and his work Paradise Lost. Milton is, to my mind, the great writer in the English language, and this work, Paradise Lost, is the greatest work in the English language as well, if not any language. Now, that's an arguable point, but certainly in the English language, for my money, it is. It deals with the fall of mankind, with paradise lost as a consequence of Adam's great transgression. And this is Milton's epic rendering of a story which we're most familiar with from the first 3 chapters in Genesis. That's what we'll begin this course with. It's a very Christian take on a classical genre, namely the epic. And it shows a great transformation for all of the commonality of a sense of moral good and moral evil, which the Christians shared with the classical world. They had a very sense of what God in his nature was like, and how he had interacted with the world, and what constituted epic heroism, what constituted the good life, what the purpose and meaning of life was, what human nature was like, what the nature of the paradise that we ought to seek would be like. We've seen that already in the survey part 1. If you followed me with the Iliad and the Odyssey, or Virgil's Aeneid, there was a decided sense of the heavens wherein the gods resided, the Olympian gods, and there was an underworld wherein the gods punished those that opposed them. That was clearly there as well, but now it's been given a greater and clearer depiction, and more in line with justice, and more in line with goodness, and with holiness, and with moral correctness, and moral probity, as well as goodness and benevolence. All of these things are played out in Milton's Paradise Lost. It's an age that comes at the end of the Renaissance. Milton's a Puritan writer, so he's a product of the Reformation. The Reformation is, to this day, I think the greatest single event in the last millennium, for certain, because what it did is it brought about a transformation, not only of the church, but of society as a whole. Because with the printing of the English Bible, a great movement of literacy began. So it's not only that the people were able to read the Bible for the first time, and they were able to read for the first time. They saw the significance of reading, and the significance of reading was directly connected with the fact that God's word was available to them. And this brought about a transformation in education, the good therein perceived, and that good ought to be shared more widely. And the product of that terrific outpouring of spiritual goodness from accessing the scriptures and being able to read them for oneself is presented very strongly in Milton's Paradise Lost. And it was against, to some degree, the Church the Catholic Church of Rome's wishes that this be so, for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into here. But he very much saw that the paradise wherein God dwells in heaven was accessible to us through the Bible, wherein we would hear of the person and work of Jesus Christ. That benefit had spread by Milton's day to the New World and elsewhere. And so I said we end with Brave New World on the course. Here in Milton's day, it's very much in terms of context, the discovery of the New World, and to some degree the flourishing or the beginning, the early flourishing of the New World. The Puritans had set sail and had landed in America and so forth, and brought with them the gospel as well in a way that transformed the Republic to our south. And following that period, and now going back to the syllabus, was the period which we tend to describe as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was very much centered on, if we're going to choose only one country, I'll choose that of my successor or my forebears, the Scots. In many ways, Scotland was very much connected with the Enlightenment. It's for about 200 or maybe 130 years. Scotland was arguably the most brilliant nation on earth, and one of the great French Enlightenment writers, whose name was Voltaire, put it this way: we look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization, and ideas and inventions which transformed the world and led in the end to Britain becoming the most prosperous country on earth. When Milton was writing, it was certainly not the case. The Republican government of Oliver Cromwell was very much an embattled little country. Milton had to write on its behalf just to keep the European powers from descending upon and destroying this new republic. And it certainly had nothing of of the greatness that came with this United Kingdom that followed that period. But what did follow that period largely flowed out of Scotland. Now, Scotland was a reformed country, very much the product of the Reformation, and the church emphasized not only the importance of education, but of engagement with the world and with transforming it and reforming it. So very much of an age of moral reformation, but also intellectual advancement. That's the Enlightenment age. It's the age of Pope and Swift on our course. We'll look at the Rape of the Lock, which is a mock epic, and Swift's A Modest Proposal, which very much assumes a sense of moral good and moral evil in his audience's mind, because it's a satire, and satires presume that audiences have that strong sense. They don't work without that strong sense. We use the word satire in our day to refer to anything that's vaguely sarcastic. Sarcasm and satire are not the same things. The vehicle for satire is an established sense of moral right and moral wrong. And the purpose of satire is to correct that. Jesus was a satirist, for example, when he spoke to the Pharisees and spoke to them and called them whitewashed sepulchres. He was using satire. He wasn't just inveighing against them. He wasn't just swearing at them. He was satirizing them. He was suggesting they ought to reform themselves, and assuming that they knew what was right and what was wrong, and just were not doing it because they were hypocrites, to use his words. Actors. That's what the word hypocrites means in the words of the Greek theater. From that time, we will move then into the Romantic period. Now, the Romantic period, and with the Romantics, we'll look at three writers, William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. With the word romantic, we do not mean what we often associate with romantic, something connected with romantic love with warm feelings and so forth. Those were connected with more what we would associate actually with the period connected with the Renaissance, courtly love poetry. There we would see romantic love being expressed. The Romantic period, on the other hand, is in many ways a continuation of the Enlightenment, but by other means. And so in this period, the movement towards Enlightenment largely was through the means of an appeal to reason and reasoning. And of course, and so it was called the Age of Reason. And it was also categorized or contradistinguished itself from the medieval period, which it termed the Dark Ages. Now, in my own opinion, the Dark Ages were not particularly dark. And if we are being very clear about what the Dark Ages were, it's probably the period that falls between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginnings of what we can see as Christian Europe. So there's a few hundred years in which there's a great deal of chaos as the Roman Empire is invaded and falls, and the period when things start to improve and so forth. The reason they improve, though, is because of the work of the church, monasteries in preserving ancient learning, all of which eventually comes to light not only through the work of the monasteries, but ironically, perhaps, through the incursion of Islam into the Christian world. And with that, the bringing of the works of Eastern Christendom, which Islam had conquered in its expansion, into contact with the Western world. And so they bring the works of Aristotle, which were only in Greek, from the Greek Christian world, from Constantinople and so forth, into contact with Western Christendom, and there's a great explosion of learning that results from this in the 12th century. And from that we get writers and theologians such as Thomas Aquinas, and also a writer we looked at last semester, Dante Alighieri, the great Renaissance poet who wrote the Divine Comedy. We looked at that last semester. But the Enlightenment saw itself as an age of reason, not in the same sense that Aquinas would have, and with lesser warrant to my view, but rather contradistinguished against Christianity. So the Enlightenment is very much, and I would say this is not true across the board, but it defines itself, particularly in its French manifestations, as an anti-Christian movement. Whereas the Scottish Enlightenment, I would say, is much less obviously so. There may be some who might lean towards atheism, or natural, or at least would be advocates of natural religion, perhaps, but they're not going to lean towards historic Christianity. But I would say, again, in Scotland, there's a much greater tolerance or circumference around the term Enlightenment, and it will include Christians as well as those who are skeptics of Christianity, whereas in France it's much more atheistic in its manifestation. This is just to show you that the word Enlightenment has a great deal of breadth, and one needs to ask exactly who is writing here and what is their vantage point, because it's not unambiguous, although we often take the Enlightenment to be an anti-Christian period. But the Romantics, to go back to my point here, sought to continue the Enlightenment, but by other means. Now, what were the other means? Well, if the Enlightenment was categorized or characterized by reasoning, the Romantics sought to appeal to feeling, because they viewed the Enlightenment rationalism of the 18th century as entirely too mechanistic, as too detached, as too dehumanized, as too much disembodied, in fact, in many ways, and to be very much of a utilitarian universe. The view of the 18th century of even human nature was very much that of a machine, and of the human soul of a ghost in a machine. Famous description of René Descartes' view of human nature, a ghost in a machine. Whereas the Romantics thought there ought to be some sort of connection to the universe around us as people that included something of our moral nature, and that the term that they used to describe that was feeling, and the connecting faculty, connecting feeling to thought, was the imagination. And so in this period, the Romantics regularly appealed to the imagination as a way of reconciling opposites, of body and soul, of heaven and earth, and so forth. The imagination was this vehicle. So we'll look at this as it's expressed in Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge, before moving on then to a whole bevy of different writers that I've chosen out of personal preference as much as anything. And I have to acknowledge when I have done this that I'm going over not only something close to over 400 years, but 400 years in which the world becomes larger. It expands to include the New World, to include Africa, to include South America, to include Asia. It becomes global, in other words. And with that includes not only different languages, but different religions and different cultures. And so it becomes very much, and we have many, many, many more texts because of the advent of the printing press and so forth. It becomes much more difficult then to choose materials without having the sense that one is excluding other materials. But there's no way of getting around that simply because that's what everyone has to do. I'm choosing the text for a sense of coherence on the course. So the coherence that will be largely to demonstrate a narrative of this sense of the move from the classical and the Christian era towards something of a post-Christian and post-humanist era. A move away from the former human understanding of human nature, for that matter, but also of the right relation of humanity to the world around it. And we'll see that presented, for example, in Robert Louis Stevenson's work, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a sort of horror novel. It's very short. Many people have not read it, although they might have heard of Jekyll and Hyde. But it's a very interesting exploration of the consequences of science when it's applied to human nature. And it marks in this period, that namely the Victorian period when Stevenson is writing, of something very new. And that is the application of modern science, not just to the world around humanity, but exactly to humanity. Mankind starts to experiment on mankind, and the consequences are often horrifying. Now, another way of looking at that might have been through the means of looking at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I do that on other courses. For example, in the sci-fi and subcreation course, I do use Frankenstein to illustrate it. And it has some merit to have looked at it here as well, because, of course, the book that the creature, the monster, reads is actually Paradise Lost. And right in the center of that narrative of Paradise Lost, the monster reads Paradise Lost. So it fit with this course, but it's 200 pages, and this is shorter, and I thought it was more appropriate to deal with it in that fashion here. But we'll see that there is a sense of unexpected consequences of using science, and often horrifying. So it starts to question whether science is as moral and objective and neutral as it appears when people use their power and influence and position in order to use the means of science. Do they do so knowing the consequences of their actions? Have they lost sight of the objectivity of moral good and moral evil when they do these experiments, even in the name of science? And I think Stevenson answers with a very determined, no, they do not. At any rate, we will then move on to the great Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson in his work, The Lady of Shalott, very much of an exploration of Arthurian themes from the Middle Ages, but now under the auspices of the British Empire. The importance of myths, and again, the importance of narratives and objectivity and perspective and so forth. Perspective being one of these things that most comes with Renaissance art. If you look at Renaissance painting and compare and contrast it to the painting of the medieval period, you will note immediately that one of the features of the Renaissance is that there is a sense of perspective. On this screen, I am front and center in the frame. I am very much in the foreground of the picture, just like a Renaissance painting. In the background, you can see behind me there are books, but the books are not the object of your attention. They're there in the background to set a stage, but there's very much a sense of of perspective on this, and I am the center of this screen as I see it myself. That's very much of a Renaissance focus. The focus is on something, and our eye is being drawn to that. Gives a sense, and the sense of proportion and perspective there, very much there in the Renaissance. From that, however, people can often be deluded into thinking that really what is at work in presenting truth is what fits our eyes and what seems to our eyes to be most important and most rational and most proportionate. What we will find from the Enlightenment onward is this obsession with scientific means of apprehending rationality and truth. We lose a sense of and detach ourselves from logical consequences and logical understandings of truth, and move away from the word towards the image, and move to very much into an age in which, as one writer, Jacques Ellul, one of my favorites, puts it, to the humiliation of the word, in which the image takes its place, very much the world in which we have grown up with, and certainly you have grown up with, as I say, as Generation Z, where you look at screens and are obsessed by that, not because of any particular character flaw, but because your world has presented it to you in the form of images rather than the form of words. And so when we study and read, we're very much swimming against the tide here, and going against the grain, for that matter, not only of your experiences, but of the way that our whole culture has conditioned us to apprehend the world. That is through images and through perceptions of things and perspectives. And there's a reason why, as I said in the when we're dealing with the millennials, why they believe that moral right and wrong were not objective, and that's because of, I think, very much because of the incursion of technology, because things could be perceived or seen a different way. And now note that even phrasing on my part, they can be seen that way, or perceived that way, or presented that way. This moves very much away from the way things actually are. How are things actually constituted? Nobody asks that question. That's a truth question. How are things perceived? That is very much, to some degree, a question of feeling. And it's a therapeutic question. How does it feel to me, as opposed to how is it? What is its nature? Those are truth questions. What is its nature? What is true and what is right? Those are very different questions than what do I like and what do I not like. We move very much into the realm of what do I like and what do I not like. At the same time, I think that this advancement, which is a technological one, is a disempowering one, because what it does is it allows technology to replace our own moral judgment and our own cultivated sense of engaging with the universe and building up a spiritual reservoir that allows us to negotiate the reality around us, gives us courage, for example, gives us fortitude, gives us wisdom. These things are not prized in the world of today. Being able to negotiate or access technology very much is. So we'll look at that in Tennyson's work and Stevenson's in the Victorian period. We'll also then shift gaze a little bit. We'll look at Leo Tolstoy's, the great Russian novelist who wrote War and Peace, his short little novella, The Death of Ivan Ilich. Fascinating account and brilliantly written, and I think you'll appreciate it very much. And if you compare and contrast The Death of Ivan Ilich to a work that I dealt with last semester, namely Everyman, we'll see very much a transformation in how death is understood. So to go back to last semester, in the case of Everyman was summoned by death to come right now, because God was calling him to die. And he said, I'm not right. I'm not fit to go to that place because I haven't lived a good life. And he immediately appealed to this understanding of goodness and and badness, and he had not lived as a good man. So that was his immediate response to death. In the case of Ivan Ilich, the response to death by Ivan himself, but also his entire culture, was to pretend it didn't happen or it wouldn't affect them. They were speaking about death as something that was surprising to them and distasteful as a topic of conversation. And we'll see how Tolstoy, in the context of 19th century Russia, deals with what is a very, I would say, contemporary response to death, namely that it shouldn't apply to me. So let's not even talk about it. And to some degree, one of the reasons I think we're currently locked down under what is called a pandemic is because a few people are dying, which is not to diminish the effect of the deaths on their relatives and loved ones. But in the great scheme, the numbers of deaths are nothing approaching what would have been the case in what would previously have been categorized as pandemics. And one of the reasons then for that, to my mind, is largely this sense that we have mastered death, and that death is something that we control. So we will admit abortion as something that we choose, or euthanasia as something that we choose, because we control death then. But this death is something that we don't control, and that is unacceptable to contemporary sensibilities. So it's about power. And again, it's about death and the meaning of death, all the while not really dealing with, well, what is life and what is death, and what is the purpose of life and what is the purpose of death. These are religious questions, questions that I think Christians have something to say about in a way that no other religion does, I will say. Because at the center of the Christian faith is a death, the death on the cross of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and his resurrection. So there's a life that comes from this death, and it's a life that is like this life and yet unlike it, in the sense that it is eternal and that it is perfect and holy and good. But I'll set that aside for a moment. We'll move on to then Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Now, I mentioned perspectives here. The Enlightenment and its symbol of reasoning is that of the eye, and clear and distinct ideas, to use the phraseology of René Descartes. In Heart of Darkness, we're set in the context of imperial Europe, the British, not just the British Empire, but the Dutch Empire and the Belgian Empire and the German Empire and the French Empire and the Italian. And all of these powers had now moved in the late 19th century in this great explosion of attempts to colonize the world. This was the period of great colonization. The world was carved up. And in the midst of Africa, in the Belgian Congo, was this dark spot that had not yet been mapped. It hadn't been seen with European eyes, so it hadn't been described in a geographic way on a map. And yet, that's only one of the sources of darkness in the Heart of Darkness, this unmapped, uncharted territory. Another was the fog that seemed to surround the novella from the beginning, when we begin on a fishing yawl on the Thames River in London. The fog had descended. We couldn't see clearly. That sense of a lack of clarity of seeing is a symbol that Conrad is using of a lack of moral clarity in what is going on in the European powers' colonization of Africa. I won't say anything more about that here, but again, note how themes and symbols and ideas are starting to overlap and appear in different ways on the course. We'll move from Conrad on to W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet of the 20th century. We'll look at a couple of his works. We'll look at Easter 1916. We'll look at The Second Coming, and we'll look at Sailing to Byzantium, all of them written in and around the First World War and the aftermath to that, in which I would say that Christian Europe, at least Western Christian Europe, was largely killed off by its own means. A great deal of soul searching ensued, and a great departure from the Christian faith, which probably began in ages previously, now escalated in this period, largely because, as I say, the great powers of the day threw themselves against each other in war for 4 years in trenches for reasons that they afterwards wondered, what on earth were we ever doing? And then 20 odd years later, threw themselves into it in a Second World War, this great conflagration that we associate with the rise of communism and fascism in Italy and in Germany. With that in mind, the totalitarian regimes of the communist era and of fascist Germany and Italy, we'll look at a few books, 2 novels, both of which I read in high school myself, and have never taught on this course before, but they seemed appropriate to me in large part because I understand they're no longer being read by everyone in high schools, and I think they ought to be understood and appreciated, and that they speak to contemporary situations better than most. So we'll look at Orwell's 1984 for 3 classes before concluding with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Both of them looking at the world in dystopian terms. So rather than the clarity of a utopia, so Thomas More writing more or less in periods not that far removed from John Milton, with very Christian notions of what a utopia would look like, although a utopia, the word means no place. This is an imaginary world. Orwell and Huxley are talking about a world which is it's presented in the terms of fiction that we call science fiction, but also dystopia. The world now is one in which science has allowed mankind to gain greater power over the world and also over human nature, and it's doing so for purposes that seem to serve the few and not the many. The effect on human nature is destructive. We'll look at the effect on human nature in particular, but also notions of freedom, also the effect on language, the language of truth, the language of perspective. We'll look at all this, and we'll look at then the incursion of propaganda and the effect on reasoning and so forth as they arise in the course. So there's some sort of congruity on the course, I think, and I'll try and emphasize that as the course progresses. Just let me say a few brief words about the means of assessment on the course before I leave it off at that for now. There are 2 essays that will be the primary means of assessment plus the exam. The first essay is due on February 3rd. It will be 1,250 words, and I'll give you the topics in a couple of weeks. And the second on March 17th, it'll be a 1,500 word essay. And again, I will give you the essay topics closer to that date before coming to the final exam, which is will be announced by the registrar. But again, it'll be an essay exam. Note that the means of assessment are through writing, through words. I believe with all my heart that the best means of cultivating the minds of my students is through words. And that's because I believe that we're made in the image of the Word of God, and that despite the humiliation of the Word, through the images that we access our world through the perspective of someone else's narrative, someone else's chosen images, there is a logic that comes with the use of language that equips us to engage with the world and to negotiate with it in ways that empowers us. And so that's why we assess by means of writing and equip you to use your gifts, linguistic gifts, in order to help you to flourish in life. So not just for my course, but for your broader benefit in general. All the other things, as I said, are there in the syllabus, more or less boilerplate on attendance and so forth. Communication will be by means of the course webpage. I will post all of my lectures on the course webpage as well as on my YouTube channel. Dr. Scott Masson, I think, is the YouTube, whatever the title of it is. You'll find the courses, the lectures there. The benefit of this, I guess, is if you've missed one, you can catch up afterwards, or even if you were there the first time and want to hear it again, then you can of course do that, because it's accessible in that way. But I will place those on the course website, the Moodle page, as well as supplementary material. So do look out for those. So please regularly check into the course webpage, not only to access the lectures, but to see if I have any supplemental materials that might help you understand the material better. But with that, I think I've said enough for now, and I look forward to speaking with you in a second, and hope that you enjoy the course. The materials, I've listed required materials and texts on the syllabus. I would advise you to buy the books and not just access them online. I can say more about that, but it does have something to do with being embodied beings and having a book in your hands. It's easier to not only to read, but to remember when you have a physical object. Studies bear this out. So even though you might have the means of accessing it online, if you can have a paper copy, all the better for you. Anyway, I'll leave it off for now and speak to you very soon.